the major ways to reduce uncertainty. Raise your hand if you feel like the best answer here is A, passive. Active, interactive, contextual. Yes, so great job. Contextual is the best answer to this question, right? When we think back to uncertainty reduction theory, you can think back to the TV show Catfish and the way that that show talked about how people will use online settings to get to know somebody, but then eventually want to meet them face to face. Passive approach, right, goes back to the idea that you see somebody else who dies from eating berries, so you don't eat berries yourself, right? It's how you observe the behavior of other people to modify what you do. Active might be something like social media stalking somebody, like a friend, or somebody you're dating to get to know them better, right? You're learning more and seeking out information about somebody else. And then interactive is when you're communicating with that other person to get to know them. So you're asking them questions, learning a little bit more about their life, and so on. So contextual is not one of those major 3 ways to reduce the uncertainty that we experience every day. So before we get started on some things for today, I want to just direct you again to some of the things that I've posted on Canvas to help you out as you're preparing in the coming weeks for some of your major assignments, and including the midterm exam that's in a few weeks. So if you go to the Canvas page for this course, again, you'll notice that on the front page of Canvas, you'll have access to midterm study guide, as well as some midterm practice questions. Those are both available for you in order to help you to prep. I've already received requests from a couple people who wanted to kind of let me know or wanted feedback on their grade that they would receive on the short essay format. So again, I'm happy to give you feedback there. So again, the study guide is right here. Study guide goes over all of the new terms and ideas that I'm asking you to know. Everything that's in, everything beyond cultural intelligence. So cultural intelligence was last class's discussion. We talked about those 4 types. We looked at Brennan and how he could incorporate cultural intelligence into his trip abroad. These new ideas here, the conversation styles, needs, self-disclosure, and listening styles, are the new terms and concepts that I'm asking you to know between now and the exam, right? So next Monday and next Wednesday, we'll be going over both talking and listening. We've also got some discussion leaders who will help us through that stuff too. And then after that, on Friday, we don't have the new reading, but we'll be going over these ideas. Monday, November 1st, again, is a midterm review day. Bring your questions, bring your ideas. We'll kind of try to make it a little bit fun as a way to review. Remember, November 3rd and 5th, we don't have class. You'll take the midterm on Canvas on your own, anytime in the 72-hour window. It doesn't need to be proctored or anything like that, but it's just designed to give you the best space to take the exam. Yes, Natalie.
I had a question. Were we allowed to have our notes while we take the exam?
Yep. Open note, open book, right? I do that for a lot of reasons, but the big reason is that I think if you cram for an exam and then like forget everything afterwards, that doesn't really do a whole lot for you, right? You don't really learn to use that stuff. I'd much rather have those notes available to you and have you kind of apply and use that stuff. Yeah, Steve.
On that prepare the exam study guide, you had a portion highlighted. Was that you just doing stuff while you're talking, or was there something about those highlighted?
Yeah, so the highlighted stuff, those are the terms and ideas that we haven't gotten to yet, and the things that we're covering next week on talking and listening. So those are helpful for you to have, because as you're getting into next week's readings, you can know, okay, I need to know these terms, and I can kind of search for those as I'm working on the reading. And again, the practice questions, there's 5 multiple choice questions that you can take that are just like the ones that we've been doing just about every day. And then once you've completed those, you can do them as many times as you'd like. After that, there's these 2 example short essay questions. If you want to email them to me and say, hey, what grade would I get on this, or what feedback do you have for me on this, I'm happy to let you know. Remember, you'll have a total of 4 prompts available on the exam. You'll pick 3 of them. If you do all 4, I'll grade your top 3. The actual exam will have the 4 pick 3 for the short essay. That's half the grade. And then the other half would be 25 multiple choice questions. So the way the exam is set up, right, it's all on one page. So you don't have to answer the first question to get to the second. You can work through it in whatever order is best for you. A format that I think works for a lot of people, right, is that they'll go through the easy questions and then spend more time going back through their notes and stuff on some of the harder questions. That's kind of designed to help you out there. That way you don't have to be forced to answer a question before you can move on. The other thing, remember, is this early feedback form. Again, I've gotten some really helpful feedback from some folks in the class. Some of the things, again, that I received feedback on were talking about a timeline for making progress on the essay, as well as ways to kind of take apart the key ideas from the readings. So feedback like that is super helpful for me to know what I can do to further support you. One kind of cool and totally unrelated element, right? So this is my first year here at EOU, and one cool thing that is available, right, is a lot of faculty get to develop new classes. So this spring, I'm teaching a new to EOU course that I'm really excited about. Working on it, getting the formal proposal out and all that, but this spring I will be teaching a class called Communicating Health and Science. So a lot of my area is in health communication, including understanding how folks with disabilities advocate for their health needs and so on, right? So that's an area that I'm super excited about. So if that's a class that you end up wanting to take in the spring or interested in, once that registration becomes available, just know that that class is something that will be offered. So I'm looking forward to that. So if you have any questions about that class or want to know more, I'm happy to send you my syllabus draft and all that stuff. Anyway, we talked a little bit about intercultural communication strategies, right? How we can be effective and attentive to other people. Again, cultural intelligence is a pretty huge factor here. Cultural intelligence being that we have this motivation and this cognitive drive to understand other cultures. We've also talked a lot about the midterm exam. Again, I know it's about just under 2 weeks away, but I still like to help you feel prepared, because I know there are all too many situations where suddenly an exam shows up on Canvas or there's a study guide the day before, and I don't think that's fair to anybody. So I like to have that well in advance for you. So cultural intelligence is something we talked about looking at, right, this TED Talk of the Flying Dead, and this idea that while you're traveling abroad and physically going to other locations, we're not always learning, engaging, or understanding other cultures. This is especially true because if you travel, there's still oftentimes a pretty big portion of the population that still speaks English. Or there's still a lot of access to things such as food, clothing, and so on that might be similar to where you're coming from. So even though we're more globally connected, it can be challenging to immerse yourself in a different culture and experience when so many people are traveling and occupying places in different ways. Talked about these 4 styles. Again, these 4 factors of cultural intelligence are essentially skills that we can use to help us better engage with and understand culture. So today's class is not meant to go over a ton of new content or information, but instead the Nasarima piece that I asked you to look at for today is another way that we can look at and understand culture a little bit better. So we talked a little bit about midterm prep. We'll be talking about the Nasarima article, and then I want to just give you a couple other things to help you with note-taking and thinking about the interpersonal analysis essay. So how many of you have ever completed an annotated bibliography? Okay, a few of you. How many of you are familiar with what an annotated bibliography is? Okay, so a few of you. So I know a lot of folks here are in their first year at EOU, and you might be wondering, as you're dealing with a lot of classes, a lot of readings, what works for taking notes. One thing that I really recommend as a note-taking style that helps a lot is an annotation style. So basically the way annotations or an annotated bibliography works is that, yeah, you've got your highlighting and you might have your notes that are specific to page numbers. But after you've read through something for a class, like give yourself a short paragraph where you're able to review the key ideas and concepts and things that you want to make sure you have. In other words, if you need to go back to this reading later, what is the TLDR synopsis that will help you to know how this fits in the class? For instance, if I were to ask you on the exam, pick 2 readings in the class outside of wrench and kind of compare and contrast the ideas they're presenting, you'd easily have those few sentences that go over the different readings, right? So this chapter looks at the role of nonverbal communication, and it includes a couple sentences that describe that chapter. That's a great way for you to go back to that later. Also, as you're preparing for or thinking about something like the essay that you'll be writing in this class, you might think about, okay, so I know that I want to write about listening. And then you can look through the listening chapter and your notes there to help you. So I think a combination of some of the more nitty-gritty inline notes on some of the key concepts and ideas can be useful. And then having that few sentences for each reading that will help you to refer back to that later. So again, I don't collect your notes on readings or anything like that. You can do whatever style works best for you. But that can be a really easy way to organize some of your thoughts and ideas. Another thing I really recommend is if you use like Microsoft Word or Google Docs, using like the headings, like headings and subheadings. That way you can navigate the different readings and notes you have pretty easily. Another thing that I used to like to do is if I would write by hand in class and then transcribe the notes after class. That way I could like review it, but also do the kind of muscle memory to remember things for later. So just some things to help you think about note-taking and particularly taking notes on the readings. Since you already know the terms you need to use for next week, you might work backwards from those and say, okay, so I need to understand self-disclosure. Where's self-disclosure in the textbook? So you might work using that. So I don't need anything until your final draft of the interpersonal analysis essay, right? You don't have to follow this timeline, but I wanted to give you a suggested timeline that might help you to make sense of and start to think about this assignment. As a reminder, this is different from the short essay portion of the midterm, which is, it's timed, it's going to be a lot shorter on the midterm, right? It's not going to be this amazing, perfectly written essay, or should it be? It's something you write in a short period. The interpersonal analysis essay is your longer writing assignment for the class, due on November 19th. The rubric and guidelines for that are on Canvas, but the basic idea here is in about 4 pages. You're looking at a relationship between 2 people or characters on a TV show or movie, right? So if you're doing a TV show, you might focus on a particular episode. If, not to get into spoilers, but like if you've watched Squid Game, maybe you focus on the Marbles episode, right? So you look at maybe an episode or a movie, right? And you look at the interaction between these 2 characters in that movie. You can also look at something like a more reality-oriented example. I've had people do something like a presidential debate and look at the relationship between the candidates and something like that. So have a good kind of thing that interests you. Maybe it's an interaction that you find really surprising, like 2 characters who are listening to each other or speaking in a way that stands out. Maybe it's like not very good listening or communication, but it stands out to you in a really interesting way, right? So you can think about some type of media relationship between people or characters that stands out to you, maybe especially interesting or one where you think, interpersonal communication connects to this. So you can start there. I'm also happy to help if you're kind of not figuring out what topic stands out to you or you're interested in, to help you to brainstorm and come up with some ideas. So you'll think about topic ideas, and then maybe, say, like a week from now, you have a possible topic. and some sources from the readings that you might be using. So maybe you're really interested into the role talking plays or the role culture plays to understand like characters from different backgrounds. And then the following week, say on November 5th, you create something like an outline where you go over the main thesis sentence that you have, what's the main idea, and what are some major body points to have. Maybe the following week, on November 12th, you have a more extended outline where you have your passages from the textbook, you have some details from the show or movie, and so on. One thing that I really recommend, right, is that if you're watching the show, episode, or film, that you kind of transcribe some of the dialogue that stands out to you. So one easy way to do that, right, is to turn on subtitles and just copy down what the characters are saying. That way you have like the written stuff to refer back to later. And then after that, right, maybe you have a draft ready 2 days or so, 2 or 3 days before the assignment is due. The reason that I recommend that, right, is the out of sight, out of mind method, where you finish something like an essay with a couple days to spare, you avoid looking at or thinking about it for like a day or two, and then you come back to it with a clean pair of eyes and the ability to identify spelling mistakes and other errors that you couldn't before. At any stage in that process, of course, you can reach out to me for draft feedback or outline feedback or anything like that as well. Again, I know that it's not for nearly a month, but since a lot of you were thinking ahead about this assignment, had some questions in that feedback form, I wanted to help to address that too. Does anybody have any questions on things related to the midterm, this essay, anything else in the class at this point? Yes, Brenna.
How long did you say this had to be?
So this should be, I believe I have it marked as 4 pages, double-spaced, standard font margins. There's both the assignment description and then the rubric kind of goes through some of the more nitty-gritty of what I'm looking for on this one. And remember, citation style can be APA, MLA, or Chicago. My advice is, if you're not a major in Comm, or you're thinking about a major somewhere, think about like what format is used the most in your major, and then you can develop this assignment with that in mind. So what I'd like us to do now is shift gears to talking about this NASAREMA piece. So if you read through the piece and you feel pretty good about it, or you have some notes available to go through, you might work on this on your own. But if you'd like some additional support, or you'd just like to chat with other people about that, you can. So either on your own or with a group of other people, I'd like you to address these questions. First of all, who are the NASAREMA? How does Miner, the author, portray the NASAREMA? And lastly, how might one practice cultural intelligence toward the NASAREMA? So I'd like you to take note of your answers to those questions. You can either write or type it. I'll grab it at the end of class. And be prepared to chat about this in just a minute. So, let's go ahead and start out with this first question. Who are the NASAREMA as a culture? I noticed this group up here had a working theory. So what did you all notice about NASAREMA as a culture? Oh, yeah.
Backwards, it's random.
Yep.
It was a spin-off of random cultures that seems like
Mm-hmm. How many folks over the course of reading or chatting amongst your groups caught on to that? American backwards. So a few folks. Maybe you've heard of or been familiar with this piece before. So if you didn't catch on to that, that's totally fine. When I first read this when I was younger, I remember I just wrote this like really long thing about how just bizarre the NASAREMA were, and I was like, what the heck? Like, what is this? What are these bizarre rituals? What are the mouthmen? What are these shrines? What are this and that? And I was so confused, right? I saw, oh, it's American backwards, and it's essentially describing many aspects of the U.S. and its culture in a very different way, right? To that end, what did you all notice in terms of how Miner portrayed the NASAREMA? What are some things that stood out?
I feel like he kind of like dehumanized them, if that makes
sense.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
talked about them as an other, not as like an equal being, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so there was this like, these strange beings, the bizarre Nasarima do these things, like they, do these strange rituals and they bake their heads in the shrines and that type of thing. It definitely felt like there was this kind of judgment of other people. Was there anything else that stood out in terms of how the Nasarima were being described and talked about? Yeah.
I guess it kind of made them seem socially undeveloped, but also like obsessive and supernatural.
Yeah. So it's like, wow, they're so concerned with their appearance and they're doing all this stuff with that in mind. And like all of these ways to modify or change the body, right, in a way that seemed unusual and kind of judgmental as well. Then that last question, how might one practice cultural intelligence toward the Nasarima? So based on the way that this article portrays United States or like American culture more broadly, what might be a way to practice cultural intelligence toward the Nasarima, toward this group?
I don't know, just go into everything with an open mind. It seemed like he was like talking about a lot of rituals, and if you were thinking about this not as American culture but as like a separate culture as he portrays it, like if an American person were to walk into this group as it's portrayed, they would be like, no, you're doing everything wrong.
Right. So like, the way that the Nasarima are portrayed in this article, it's very much this, well, this is strange, this is wrong. If someone was lacking like cultural intelligence or motivation, somebody would come in and say, hey, you should do this differently, this behavior is strange, right? Cultural intelligence might mean something like understanding. Why does this group care so much about their appearance? If it's American, right, it's about the role that things such as media portrayals of the ideal body or way to be, might factor in, right? So for instance, in the United States, right, there is so much emphasis placed on how physical appearance factors into everything that you do in terms of the items that you buy, the way that you present yourself, how your personality factors in, that because that's such a major element of culture in the US, that would be something that would make sense for members of that group to be really concerned with in a way that doesn't necessarily stand out in the same way to outsiders, right? The way that so many of these details about life in the United States are portrayed, again, the holy mouth men or the dentists, the shrines, right, or the restrooms, bathrooms that people use for things like preparing makeup and so on, baking your head, right, using something like a hairdryer. All of these things are portrayed in this really unusual and kind of silly way, such that it kind of flips things on its head, right? So it's an interesting way for us to kind of think about culture in a somewhat different light. So this piece was written in 1952, it's a lot older, and the author, Horace Minor, was actually an anthropologist. So one of the things to help understand this article and why this article exists is that there was a trend in kind of this era of writing and research in areas like anthropology, sociology, communication, history, and so on, right? And this broader trend was the idea that you would go in to another culture or group. Typically somebody from the United States or Europe, right, would travel. And maybe it was an indigenous community, maybe it was a country or space that was not as well known, right? But you would go in and you would analyze and take notes on this bizarre and strange population, right? And then you would share and publish those findings and be like, look at this strange group of people that I, traveled to and analyzed, right? And that was this whole genre that started to emerge. And it's got a lot of problems, right? First of all, it's incredibly ethnocentric, right? It takes this sort of US or Europe-centric approach to analyze cultures and just be like, look how bizarre it is. It's lacking things like cultural intelligence, right? Because it's not thinking about or respecting other cultures. It's instead, in many ways, rushing to make a judgment about how other cultures are or should be. And, right, it doesn't necessarily account for the role that things such as colonialism can play into that too, right? The idea that the settling and occupation of other countries and something going all the way back to like muted group theory is impacting the culture and identity of other groups. That going in and portraying other cultures in this US-centric lens can do damage to a lot of the issues impacting communities, right? So that's a lot of what was going on at the time, were these kinds of articles depicting these other nations or groups as savage, as strange, as weird. And so Miner had this kind of satire or critique of that, right? Where he was like, well, what if we take this exact same way of writing and thinking about other cultures and groups, but use an outsider perspective to describe the US, and describe what people do in the US in a way that, like you were saying, has this kind of dehumanizing or object-oriented approach toward people. So the details here, right, using these different words like the holy mouth men and so on to describe basic things that we take for granted and do every day in a new light was meant to serve as part of this critique. But it also kind of helped us to understand and think about why we described other cultures the way that we did, right? So Miner kind of poses the question, how do we talk about other cultures? Oftentimes as savage, as strange, as weird, as not something we understand. What would happen if we talked about the US, right, the same way that we talk about other cultures? So that was a lot of the goal there, right? And while nationality is tied to culture and can be an aspect of cultural identity, right? There's a lot of smaller and smaller cultures that exist, or co-cultures, right? So the experience of living in the United States or being American means very different things for very different people. It's expressed in a lot of different ways, right? And culture includes things beyond nationality as well, but the US was used as this example here. So again, this satirical look was designed to flip things around and say, what if we talked about the US the same way we talked about other groups? So I share this reading because I think it's a helpful application to something like interpersonal communication. It helps us to think about and use the ideas that we've been talking about so far in the class, right? That is, we can easily rush to view these other cultures and groups as strange, as weird. But if we reframe our own culture, we can see that it can be, at times, really unusual and not make sense to an outsider as well, right? The focus on things like appearance, the concern that we have for maintaining physical appearance, might not make sense to somebody from another culture or group, and might cause us to reassess and think about elements of our own culture. So it helps us to better understand how somebody like an outsider can relate to or not how our culture experiences it. One thing that oftentimes happens, right, in terms of your own culture and your own background growing up, is that it's taken as the normal, the taken for granted default, this is how something is. But if you have somebody from the outside who looks at the issue differently, it can help us to think about why we have those assumptions. So, for instance, we tend to put a lot of Western approaches to medicine kind of on a pedestal. One idea being something like the Cartesian dualism, right, or the split between mind and body. And a lot of non-Western approaches to medicine look at kind of holistically how does the human altogether, and a lot of different elements like mental, emotional health, and so on, factor in. Obviously, there's been a lot of work to integrate these approaches, but a single approach towards something like medicine is not the same way that everybody's going to approach the topic, right? Similarly, if we feel frustrated reading this piece and thinking, geez, like they seem like they're really judging us or treating, our culture in a way that's not really understood, well, that's how a lot of cultures and groups have felt for a really long time. And the importance of empathy, motivation, and those skills in cultural intelligence is a way for us to understand, rather than judge, the experiences that members of different cultures have, right? And in this way, the NASA-REMA piece is an example of how we can challenge our ethnocentrism by, again, thinking about what would happen if this approach toward human behavior was not the taken for granted or the ideal or what we should behave or do. What does it mean for us to think about from an outsider's perspective what the United States culture, identity, and so on could look like? So, when you're thinking about and placing this reading overall in the class, think about it as an application for using things such as cultural intelligence and bridging the divides that you might have noticed here. And also think about how it can challenge some of the elements of ethnocentrism that we've been talking about so far in the class. So it's a way for us to understand that and a way for us to think about how we communicate about and talk about other cultures. So it's kind of a helpful example and application. I might, for instance, give you a short essay question where I ask you, pick 2 readings outside of the Wrench book and identify the major arguments or ideas here. You might use something like the NASA-REMA piece as an instance of showing how culture is talked about and defined in a somewhat satirical way, right? So if you didn't recognize it was American backwards or can piece that together, that's totally fine. Again, it took me a while to figure it out. But it is, I think, kind of a fun and interesting piece that sort of summarizes our key ideas from this week. So for next week, we have some more discussion leaders, and I'm looking forward to hearing from more people in the class. Next week on Monday, we'll talk about talking. How do we talk? How do we use talking as a way to get to know one another, but also different styles of talking and communicating? I think the talking and communicating are both really cool applications to interpersonal communication that we do every day. So I'll grab either your written prompt for today, or you can email or send it to me. Otherwise, make sure to complete that feedback form by the end of the day today if you haven't already.